I'm not sure what the sermon would have been if I had it here with me, but I would like to build it around three separate kinds of accounts. The theme is celebration. And one of the most exciting things about celebration is to be found in the quote, which I put at the top of the bulletin for this week. Celebration is worship. But it's difficult to know a little bit about worship unless we understand that worship extends far beyond what happens on a church on a particular morning. Unless we understand that celebration is an activity of life that reaches out and touches the heart of everybody's life at all times, if they truly would seek to know God and to respond to Him. Celebration is not a worship service in the sense of a service, but it's worship in the sense of life and reaching out. It's worship in the sense of caring and sharing. It's worship in the sense of living as God would have us live. And that be true whether it be as individuals, as families, or as a church family. For as we begin this year, we ought to recognize that celebration comes not only what happens here on a Sunday morning, but as each one of us touches the lives of others at the time of pain or at the time of joy. When we share in the happiness of an occasion as well as when we find the unhappiness that all too often comes in our lives. And so I'd like to begin with three stories, each one of them, I think, helping us to focus on that. None of them new, perhaps, but by their familiarity will help us to set the tone of where we as a church ought to be going this year under God. First is the Apostle Paul. How great is the joy I have in my life in the Lord. After so long a time, you once more had the chance of showing that you care for me. I don't mean that you had quit caring for me. You did not neglect me. And I'm not saying this because I feel neglected, for I've learned to be satisfied with what I have. I know what it is to be in need and what it is to have more than enough. I have learned this secret so that anywhere at any time I am content, whether I am full or hungry, whether I have too much or too little. I have the strength to face all conditions by the power that Jesus gives me. For your kindness to Chris and I, that passage has a tremendous amount, for you've never stopped showing kindness, but you responded to some needs and helped us at a time that's very difficult, and we give thanks for that. There's a power there at the same time that reaches out beyond even that, for each one of us has to recognize that as we go through life, we face things which we don't always understand. We have conditions going on around us over which we have no control. And one of the things that I've learned by, again, traveling and witnessing the dynamics of travel is that there is no excitement in travel unless you bring yourself to it. Many of you have traveled this year, and you know exactly what I mean. A person who has not got the inner excitement and strength to reach out gets nothing from their travels. They're bored, they're unhappy, they don't know what's going on. They look around and they say, give me some excitement, why don't I feel anything? But they don't recognize that deep down within inside them is the excitement which brings it to the travels. I've never before had the experience of 8 days in Paris with a 7-year-old. It terrified me. What do you do with a 7-year-old in Paris? Well, what you do with a 7-year-old in Paris is let the 7-year-old dictate what you do and follow along and see things you've never seen before. It was an incredible experience. David was alive to what was happening. He knew only of the Eiffel Tower in reality, and the first evening there we went to see the Eiffel Tower. I spent 2 months every night reading underneath the Eiffel Tower, and I never went up into it, and he said, let's go up. And we went up. And I saw something of Paris I'd never seen before because the excitement of what he was seeing instilled in me an excitement that I didn't know. And he said, what's that, and what's that? And pretty soon I found myself guiding as we walked around the Eiffel Tower and reaching out to Sacre-Cœur, to the Arch of Triumph, to a little soccer field where I learned what soccer was all about, watching games night after night, to the island over which I had lived, and I could point out the apartment house that I had stayed in. And as we went around, a new excitement came, growing out of his excitement for what he was seeing. We went to Versailles, that magnificent palace, built basically by Louis XIV. And we ended up with a terrible, terrible, terrible day, pouring down rain, a busload of 47, 48 people, no way to see anything at all. And I was disappointed because though we had an excellent guide, it was crowded that particular day, and 50 people it's difficult to communicate with. In about the third or fourth room, I saw the woman who was the guide pushing an adult aside and going like this to David. And after she'd given and pointed out some things, she would bow down and she would say something to him and point out something, and he would ask something of her, and I couldn't quite follow it. But on the bus on the way back, we chatted with the guide, and she said, you know, being a guide is a terribly boring job if you don't have anybody listening. I wanted to say, I know, I preach every Sunday. But she said, you know, what's exciting is to find somebody listening. And she said, your son's incredible. He grasped and he felt and he looked and he asked questions she had never been asked before. Where do they go to the bathroom? She explained chamber pots. Why didn't the king and queen sleep together? That one I wanted to hear the answer to. She explained it was only 100 years later that the double bed was developed. Very nicely done, wasn't it? I had all other kinds of ideas in mind. And we saw something because he brought with him an excitement of life that reached out. And as I was meditating upon that on the long trip home and delays in an air flight, that we sat around waiting and thinking about the sermon and thinking about Pine Hill, as I had done so much of the time, I thought, you know, it's very easy to sit around in a church and to find things that are wrong and to say, oh, this isn't going right, or that's not going right, or I don't like this, and so on, and somehow ask for the church to stimulate me. But the excitement about what I learned from Paul and what I learned from my son David on this particular thing is that I bring for me the excitement of Pine Hill. You bring for you the excitement of Pine Hill. And in sharing that excitement together, we see things we would never see alone. I have a love for Paris now. It's a little different than I've ever loved it before because I shared it with somebody else's eyes. The second thing, story is told that there were a group of people who were extremely poor down in Louisiana, in the Bayou country. They sat around and they complained bitterly about what was happening in their lives, and why didn't they have more money, and why didn't they have this, and why didn't the government do this, and why didn't people help them with this, and all kinds of things. And the church services became very much down as people poured out the anger of their existence in every area of their life. It went on for some time, according to the story, until a little old lady stood up and said, wait a minute. Each one of us as a family has a boat. Each one of us lives on a bayou. That bayou leads to the river, and the river leads to the ocean, and the ocean leads to anywhere we want to go. If we really want to do something, let us get in our boats and go across the bayou to the river, and the river to the ocean, and make for us what we want it to be. Fits nicely into that first thought, doesn't it? For the direction of a particular thing in our lives not only falls deeply upon us, but it falls upon others as well. But it means that whatever we want in the way of a church, it has to come from each of us as we direct our way. Each one of us, in our sense, are caught in our own little boats of life moving along. We can make the decision to stay in the bayou and be happy and content there and work within that. That's a valid decision if we are happy and content and work within it. But we can also make the decision to move and to see and to feel and to give direction to our own lives. And that's essential too. For perhaps the worst thing in the world is the sense of lack of direction and the feeling that you have no ability to make change. It is the depression of that weight upon each one of us that ultimately destroys our joy of life. And if I can be absolutely corny, this boat called Earth, this good ship called Pine Hill, this life called Jim Lyons, isn't going anywhere unless I dip my paddle and pull hard and help to make it propel towards those things I consider to be great. But ultimately beyond that, and this is a story I've told you before, but I want to read it. Ultimately beyond that is a recognition that none of it is of any value if we don't have God in our lives. For true celebration, as we said, is worship, and worship is God active in our lives and us active in His life as we share it one with the other. A few years ago when I was at Wayne State University, Elie Wiesel, who went through the Holocaust, who ended up in Auschwitz, a young man of 16, was beginning to reflect for the first time in his life and to write about what that experience meant. Another young man, a Jewish young man from this country who had married a Dutch Jew, said and raved and ranted in an afternoon lecture about the evils of what went on, and he had never experienced any of it except secondhand. Elie Wiesel, in one of the most tender moments I've ever seen in my life, reached out and said, with an auditorium full of 700-800 people, "Dick, I want to talk to you about what you said and my experiences." When I think of the Jews in the camps, what astonishes me is that so many of them remained human despite anything. I'll give you an example. As I told you, I came from the yeshiva, that's the place of study, the Jewish school, taken away straight from the Talmud, the Jewish writings which they were studying. All of us, I wasn't the only one. When I say I mean all of us. Were taken away from the yeshiva, from the Talmud, straight to Birkenau. And for 3 days I was in a daze. I couldn't believe what I saw. Then I awakened, and I remembered that immediately after, it must have been on the 4th or 5th day, I was sent to be a commando. I carried stones. The man with whom I carried stones, I never saw his face, only his neck, and I remember only his voice. The very first day he asked me, "Where do you come from?" I told him. "What did you do at home?" "I was a yeshiva boker, the boy of the yeshiva, a student of the Jewish learnings. I studied." He said, "What tractate, what chapter did you study?" I told him. He said, "What page?" I told him. He said, "Let's continue." I said, "Are you mad? Here, without books, without anything, and why?" He said, "We must continue. That is the only way." And believe it or not, we continue. I don't think she would mind if I mentioned this today because it fits so nicely. One of our church members called, who could not be here today, about something this morning, and I asked about her husband's brother, who I knew had been sick. He passed away, she said, in July. And I said, "I'm sorry, but I'm grateful because I knew something of what he was going through." And she said, "No, he didn't die of cancer. He died of a heart attack." And I said to her, "What was he like?" He was a priest. She said, "The night before he died, he called and he invited us to go to the shore with him. He was full of plans and he was full of life and he was eager to do what he could." He said, "You have just given me the inspiration and the feeling of what the whole sermon is all about today. Not only do I have to learn to be content and operate within what I can and work with what I can change and change what I can change and accept what I can't change, but I also have to live life to its fullest and be full of plans and of hopes and of dreams. When the dreams are shattered, I put it back together with love of people like you and the support of a church and the ability to celebrate, even in the unhappiness of life, with God, and to make real in my life that which He has taught us. Peace I leave unto you. Not as the world gives us, but peace I give unto you. May the excitement of this year and the sharing of our love together ultimately mean at the end, when we begin to wrap up all of the programs and all, we can look back over and say one to the other, "Thank you. You've helped me to have peace."